Your turn to intro, Dill.
I don't want to. Hi, welcome back to Calgary Barbell. This is Form Check Friday. I don't want to do the intro. Take it away, Bryce.
All right. Intro part 2, take 2. We're here with Nick Manders again. I told you he might be here. It's been a week. I'm wearing the same shirt. My hair's not changed. Maybe something is up.
I've been living in the SPD sweater since I got it.
Anyways, we are here for Form Check Friday. We're going to take your videos. We're going to put them up on the screen somewhere. And we're going to offer you some technique advice. If you're looking to submit your videos, go ahead and check in the description box below. And if you want to check out Nick or Nick's coaching company, where can they find you, Nick?
N.Manders on Instagram, or Clean Strength Fitness also on Instagram, or on the website, cleanstrengthfitness.com.
There you go.
Hopefully, it's still getting work done.
It's coming soon.
Yeah,
TM.
hopefully by the time this video's out, it's done.
This should be April 5th. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
I'm not in charge of that. I'm just a coach.
All right, Dylan. We're starting with Chris.
Yep.
And he's doing some squats.
This is Chris. He's a Masters 1, 82.5 kilo lifter. He competes in the USPA.
Okay.
He says he's been training for 20 years, powerlifting for 4 years. And he's experiencing some tendon inflammation in my left elbow when squatting. I know my left wrist is in quite a bit of extension and grip is fairly wide. Doing a bunch of mobilization exercises for shoulders and wrists. I've experimented with different grips, false, light, grip widths, elbow angles, and bar positions, but can't seem to find a position that I can get into with loading my elbow.
I am gonna say that the way you're carrying the bar is probably the first thing I would investigate. If we watch your lift here, Chris, right on the bottom, we see the shoulder blade moving pretty freely forward. If we see you on rack, there's a lot of like shrug. There's a lot of upward tension pulling up. It doesn't really look like the bar is that stable. And I think we're seeing elevation and we're seeing protraction in the shoulder blade, probably on both sides, but it tends to be that, yeah, our symptoms will manifest maybe more on one side than the other. And I think that if we found a way to get more retraction and more depression of the shoulder blade here, then we would be able to tilt the shoulder into a position where there's a lot less of that extension demand and a lot less tension through the extensors of the elbow and the wrist there, or the wrist specifically, sorry. And I think that if we didn't, see this bar moving kind of freely, falling forward, shoulder blade moving around to try to stabilize it, if the upper back were tighter and held in a bit better position, I think we might be able to mitigate some of those symptoms. And again, the way I would do that is probably like, you can see out of the rack here, you're having to pause in your unrack before we even move the bar shift, right? You pick it up, the bar starts shifting and falling as you take a step. So like this is not set up or tight enough. And that is 100% the first place I would look to try to fix, specifically to work on this. There's some other stuff squat and brace wise that maybe we'll get into here, but what do you think, Nick? What's your go-to for that kind of stuff?
So what I'm thinking right away is we lower the rack height. I think that you're very shrugged up. Mm-hmm. When you come out, you sort of clip the rack a bit. If you lower it, that'll let you be, I think that right now we're picking up the bar a lot with our hands and holding it a lot. We want to pick it up with our back. And to do that, I think we need a more depressed position. I almost like to think about trying to get my ribs underneath the bar and trying to pick it up with my sort of like torso and with my ribs. Mm-hmm. Get the ribs farther back. And I think to do that, you're going to need a slightly lower rack position. So that way you can wedge yourself into the bar more so than like picking it up out of the rack.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start.
I think, if you're really feeling it in your elbows, you need to place the majority of the bar, the vast majority of the bar, on your torso. It might even be like a quick fix, just chalk your back up. Get more friction on your back so that way you aren't forced to take so much of that brunt in your arms. Mm-hmm. I think that those two things, lowering the rack height, putting a bit of chalk on your back, and then also, we can talk about like bracing, bringing the ribs back a bit to like help sort of get that torso underneath the bar and get that bar more stable and depressed and wedged into us. Mm-hmm. That's going to alleviate a lot of elbow stress. It's also going to, I think, clean up a lot of the squat. It's going to make the walkout a bit cleaner. The walkout looks very,
choppy.
It doesn't look smooth. It doesn't look like every single step is planned. It looks like you're just trying to get out of the rack. It looks uncomfortable, right?
And I think in terms of the bracing with the movement as well, it looks like the very first thing we're trying to do on the descent is extend the back, right? As you sit, we're trying to like drive chest up. You can see we're in a very extended position here. We get to the bottom and then boom, we get pulled forward. We end up in what I would consider probably a great torso angle for squatting. Really nice position here, but I would say get this on the way down so that it's the same on the way up. We might also alleviate a lot of the issues of the shoulder, elbow, wrist if we don't go from here to here with the weight on your back every rep, right? Because the more we're falling forward, the more that shoulder's rolling forward, the more the bar is pulling forward, the more you're having to grip it so it doesn't roll around, the more stress is going through that whole kind of system there. So I think, very, kind of done to death cue on Form Check Friday, but get the ribs down, try to brace through the front of yourself a little bit better. I think a lot of people put a lot of priority on bracing and, tension all through their back, but not a lot of people, or not enough people maybe, are putting enough emphasis on bracing through the front, pulling the ribs down, pulling the pelvis up even a little bit, just to make sure that we're getting into that leaned position, that we're holding a consistent torso angle and consistent torso position through the descent and through the ascent that looks maybe a little more similar if we were to play it, forwards and backwards.
Ribs down. Also, I think that like chest back is an underrated cue. I think that trying to push the chest back does help expand sort of the ribs backwards as well. It creates a weirdly nice shelf, and if you need to be placed in more relative flexion because you are overextending, pushing that chest back does help expand sort of that posterior thoracic side.
Yeah.
So chest back could work.
Oh, I like that cue.
I like the plates though.
Yeah, there you go.
Manders 10.
Use code Manders10 at Hansu Power. I don't know if we can say that. Can we, Dylan?
I don't know.
We don't have a contract yet.
No.
I don't know. I can say it, I think.
You can say it. All right, Dylan, who we got next, man?
Next up, we have Lucas. Lucas says, my leg drive feels inconsistent. Sometimes I feel planted and really strong with it. Other times my butt rises and it just doesn't feel like it does much. Some sets it feels amazing, but this set it varied between the reps.
Okay. I have a pretty specific take on this. The people have probably heard it before. If you've ever watched this show, I'm a big fan of the very consistent leg drive, but I'm interested to hear what Nick has to say about this whole conundrum here.
I want to see the setup. I always want to see the setup. I think that cutting the setup out of your videos, if you're trying to look at the, especially, actually no, all three of them. I don't know why I said especially, but I guess with bench especially, it is so setup indicative, right? How you set up is how you're going to perform the lift, and if you're cutting that part out, it's really hard to see what the lifter's doing to get into that position. I think that with bench, friction plays such an important role that if I don't see how you're setting up your leg drive, how you're setting up sort of like that shoulder position, are you sliding into the bench? Are you planting yourself on the bench with your shoulders and then sliding your feet into place? It's really hard to see where we're creating tension from and how we're using that leg drive initially, right? Because if we're just putting our feet into place and then our shoulders are already locked in and then we slide our feet in, I find it's a lot harder to get that constant leg drive, right? You want to almost kick it into place. Whereas if you slide into the bench, you sort of turn on that leg drive initially, and then you could keep it on throughout as you unrack it. But as for what we have to actually look at and see here, I know you're a big fan of heels on the bench. I'm not as much of a fan. Just
Heels
because,
on the bench? Oh, like using a heel
shoes,
shoe. Okay,
shoes.
yeah.
Obviously, feet on the bench not allowed in any good powerlifting federation.
Oh,
I don't know. I keep saying that.
That's fair.
Anyways,
it's spicy.
heeled shoes, I'm not a huge fan of them just because I find that a lot of them are decently slippery, right? Speaking about friction and all that,
yeah.
Unless you can really wedge yourself into a position where the heel sort of places your foot and your knee and your hip and that entire complex into a position where no matter how hard you push it isn't gonna move, you're gonna be losing it somewhere, right? And here it looks like it tends to be his hips, right? I think they kick up on like a rep or here too. And I think that's just because for whatever reason, he isn't able to lock in that whole position with the heel shoe. So I think instead, switching to a flat with a lot of friction, and I think that that's what a lot of powerlifting shoes nowadays have really sort of pushed as like their big marketing thing is we have the stickiest sole on the market.
Yeah.
What that allows you to do is that you can push much more into the shoe, put a lot more of your emphasis into the foot, and then the knee and the hip are sort of locked in as a result of that. So I think that it's not so much that I don't love heels for benching, just as much as I love a stickier shoe. Those shoes probably, especially on that floor, are a bit slippery. And instead of being able to just sort of focus on pushing that foot forward and sort of driving your toe into like the front of your shoe, to keep your feet from slipping, you need to kick down a bit harder, and that's resulting in like the hip shooting up and the feet and the leg drive feeling a bit on and off, not too great.
Yeah. So what Nick's talking about is you're having to push more pressure downwards than would be ideal or than that he would coach, and as a result of that downward pressure is contributing to your hips rising. And I think what what Nick is advocating for here is to get a stickier shoe so that you can emphasize more pushing out this way to apply pressure back this way, which is generally speaking what we're trying to get out of leg drive with the bench. Yeah? Yeah.
And I think too, we'll just keep going with like the lines of friction and leg drive. If you don't have a sticky enough pad, and you're on a comp pad anyways, so it's
like
difficult. Like I wouldn't suggest putting a bands on it or a pad on it or anything. I would say though,
I thought you were a big fan.
Big fan of putting stuff on the bench.
Yeah.
No, I would say though that okay, you already have a bench on or a belt on rather. Get a friend to help hike the back of your shirt down. You can do this in competition under a singlet. Expose more of the neck. Skin sticks really well to pads. Shirts don't as much. I like to train exclusively in tank tops when I bench for this reason. You expose a lot of neck. You stick to the bench really well. You can emulate it in comp, either by hiking your shirt down, or if you're on like a Eleiko charcoal pad, they tend to be sticky on shirts anyways. But I think that's an old Eleiko. It might actually be retrofitted looking at the edges. It might be a charcoal. But for the majority of pads that do have sort of that like vinyl texture to it, hiking down the shirt, wearing a low cut neck shirt, anything like that is going to help you create sort of that like push away with like the feet forward and like the shoulders and neck back into the bench to sort of lock in that system, right? Because then if you have leg drive, you're trying to create this structure that sort of pushes in both ways to bow at the top. And then aside from that, if you want to just really lock it in, I think he's maybe touching a bit low. I think we might disagree on that. I know you like a bit more of a low touch, but I find that if people touch really low, if they touch really low, what tends to happen is that the shoulders really slide back because the center of mass sort of shifts them over, right? And they dump a bit, and then it slides back.
Into it. Yeah.
Whereas if you can sort of use the bar to pin yourself into the bench, then you can really drive with your legs because your shoulders aren't going anywhere because the weight is driving you into the bench. And then you can, so if you touch a bit higher and you wear more sticky shoes and you have a shirt that's more conducive for the bench, you're going to be locked in, right?
Okay.
Or pine tar resin.
I think honestly, I've had the exact opposite experience with the whole skin versus shirt thing.
Really?
I think I sweat too much.
Maybe this is a lightweight thing. This is an 83
my
versus a 120.
skin is just going to be like slip sliding all over the place
Really?
because by the time I get warmed up, I'm sweaty. So I think I've avoided tank tops.
That's the thing I go
pretty
from,
much
like,
every time I've benched.
big equipped guys though.
Really?
Like every big equipped guy I know is like, hike down the shirt, expose all that skin, really drive yourself into the bench. That's what I got from them. So
Well, I would say play around with it and see if one is a little stickier than the other for you. Maybe I'm just kind of an oily guy. I don't know.
I barely sweat, so take the two, see where your sweat levels are at.
Yeah, it's going to depend on how much you sweat. I mean, I think the thing I would add, I'm a big fan of all of Nick's points there. I think the only thing I would add to that is just trying to, regardless of how you're applying the leg drive, I would try to keep it more consistent throughout the lift. I would try to apply you know, 10 to 20% more on the way down, so that there's a difference or less of a difference in how hard we're driving with the legs when we start to press. Because I think if you're applying more throughout the lift, there's going to be less room for the hips to move around. There's going to be less, you know, of that movement transferring up into your upper back. There's going to be less of that sort of shiftiness and dynamic, and a little more consistency and a little more similarity between how well supported and how stuck to the bench we are on the descent versus the ascent. So I think for me, looking at this bench, what I would say is try to use a little more leg drive on the way down, maybe try to lighten the touch a little bit. You know, very, very different strokes for different folks kind of thing when it comes to bench touch and how we apply the leg drive. But looking at this, I would try to push you in that direction and see if we can get anything out of it.
Yeah, I think setup aside, like the cue of like keeping the sternum high is just pretty universal, right? And it's something that he's collapsing a bit under.
Yeah.
So yeah, just trying to keep that sternum high, keeping the leg drive on, no matter what your setup is, regardless of the portion of the movement, it's important.
Okay. Cool. Well, thanks for sending a bench in. We were just talking about how much we like coaching the bench, because we both had to work very hard to have even quasi-respectable benches.
Now we're on
So-
the deadlifts.
and now we're back to the deadlifts. What do we got here, Dill?
So this is Phil, longtime fan of the channel, and I think this lift will be a good discussion because Phil has, I think, questions about using a belt.
Do you want to start or should I?
I mean,
Okay.
Yeah,
Go. Take it away, man.
But like, yeah, this is relevant just to give some info. Nick doesn't deadlift with a belt, so I think he's the perfect person to maybe weigh in on this.
Yeah.
yeah, don't deadlift with the belt. I somewhat advocate for trying without a belt, and I mean, in this case, you don't have to use one. If all the belt is doing is injuring you and popping your ribs out and a bunch of bad stuff, you don't have to put it on. You know,
Yeah.
if you feel stronger without it and putting it on hurts you, you don't have to wear it. You just don't have to. If you feel like your hook grip is strong and your whole setup changes with straps, you don't have to wear straps. I think a lot of these issues are just don't wear a belt, don't use straps, and you're probably on like a better path than you are right now. Not saying you're on a bad path. These pulls look pretty good, but I think that they would just look a lot better and a lot more specific to, I think, where your body wants to go and what the sport is going to allow you to do if you just ditch the equipment and pull these with nothing but your thumbs.
Yeah. I in this case, I absolutely agree. I'm an advocate of belting up for deadlift. I do it. Most of my clients do it, but I have certainly worked with people in the past who pull better without a belt. That's a very real thing. A lot of the times the belt gives you either too much or the wrong proprioception, so your bracing becomes different. I've also, anecdotally, I've forgotten to put my belt on for heavy, challenging sets. This has been a long time since, but some of the heaviest training I was doing of a block, I just forgot my belt, pulled the set, and then went to open my belt and take it off and was like, oh, whoops, I didn't wear it. And I just pulled a PR set of 4 and didn't even notice. So, you know, I definitely think of, if we were to look at the squat and the deadlift and the impact of a belt on bracing and that impact being net positive, I think probably gonna see a very significant net positive impact on the squat, much more generally than you will on the deadlift. I think on the deadlift, it's way more of a mixed bag. And yeah, wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people out there have a lot of success without a belt. In terms of the deadlift itself, I think there's a big difference between how you're pulling these earlier sets and then about midway through, you kind of change things up to where you're kind of like pulling the slack twice. And I think it puts you in a weird position. So this first rep here is a great rep, right? You kind of pull down into it and then you go, right? You pull the slack as you get into position. And then on the second rep, you kind of pull the slack with like hips high.
It's almost like he's doing like a paused rep.
Yeah.
He did say that was to emulate like a certain bar, but I feel like it's like the wrong way to go about it.
Yeah. And I think at this point, like, yeah, the bar's off the floor and you've just gotten into position. You know, if that's 110% or 105%, that's going to be really funky. So I think the way that you're pulling in this first rep, where you're like getting the tension as you pull into position and just kind of going for it, I don't think it needs to be more complicated than that. I think, you know, there was a bunch more back and forth about the slack pull and whether the best lifters are pulling the slack or whether it's part of the lift. I don't know if that was you guys or if that was just Mayhar.
It was me, but it was more so with the stiff bar. I think with deadlift bars, it's a lot different. What bar did he say he was competing with? Was it going to be
Texas deadlift bar.
Texas
What
deadlift
is this
bar?
one?
This one's just like a Texas bar.
Oh, yeah, Texas power bar. So you're not even gonna get that much more whip out of a Texas.
Honestly,
deadlift
with
bar,
the bumpers on the bar, I think you're
pretty
already
similar,
emulating it, right? You don't need to like change your technique to try and emulate for it. I think that you got to change the bar maybe, right? If this is a power bar and you're going to be training or deadlifting or competing, I don't know, competing on a deadlift bar, putting the bumpers on it, that's probably going to be enough, right? But actually change your technique. Now you don't have a technique anymore, right? If this is like a weird specific accessory technique, how do you pull normally, right?
Yeah.
You're going to now do this weird double pause. You're gonna do this sort of like pull the slack out and then try to pull it higher than the slack is. Now the weight's completely off the ground, so you're not really pulling slack anymore. You're just doing pause deadlifts, which aren't bad, but
I think especially on this rep, you can see it really well, right? Like you start the pull from just this like non-ideal position. And I think I can say that comfortably, seeing the positions you could get into and pull from. Like, you don't want to be pulling from here. You know what I mean? With your hips way up behind you, like trying to stiff leg it off the floor before you actually take advantage of, oh yeah, it's like you just kind of slam it off the floor and then you're like, oh yeah, I'm a sumo puller, I should get into position. You know what I mean? Like this first rep, again, I'm just going to use as an example of getting into position as you pull the slack. You pull as much slack as you need to with your upper body there to kind of get the slack out of the bar and get an idea for where position's going to be and where you're going to like catch the weight of the bar, which I think is the big thing with the deadlift bar, right? Is that you kind of don't catch the weight of the bar until higher up than maybe what you're used to with a stiff bar or even a Texas power bar. But as long as you have an idea for where that end range is, where the slack ends, I think you can really smoothly pull off the floor without having to do a bunch of extra stuff, you know?
yeah, I think this whole thing has been like a case in like comparison and like feeling like, okay, well, these guys deadlift on a Texas bar, they deadlift a specific way. Sumo pullers have this very like externally rotated knees out position. I need to try and emulate that. So my favorite pullers use a belt. I need to do that. It seems like your body and like the way you pull is more or less leading you into like your most optimal position. You know, I think that the stance and like the width and everything look great here. I wouldn't change them at all.
I agree.
I wouldn't force an externally rotated position just because someone else does it.
No.
Your body is fighting against the belt. It doesn't want to wear one. Just don't. I think that you have everything you need already, and you're just trying to force yourself into like someone else's perception of what ideal is. You need to just stick with what you have, and you're already doing great.
Yeah. Yeah, like the reps where you just kind of like do the thing are really good reps. Like you have a very good deadlift. You know, if somebody sent me this first rep and was like, what can I change? I would say like, don't change anything.
Just
Like
ditch the strap.
That's a great rep. You know what I mean? And I'm not even super anti-strap, but the fact that these are all singles, I mean, yeah, if we're pulling a bunch of singles, we should be able to do them without straps. You know what I mean? And it looks like that's the majority of the work that you've sent in here is like 4 or 5 singles or something. If you can't do 3 singles in the same training session, you're gonna go to a meet and you're gonna have a bad time. So do at least 3 singles without straps. And if your workout is 5 or 6 singles, I would recommend trying at least to do all of them without straps. Anything else to add?
No. I mean, if you are worried about a thumb tearing, I'd tell my athletes to just every single set, check on your thumb, and if you need to, throw on straps for the next one, but try and get as many done as you can with your thumb.
Yeah. All right. But yeah, Philip, you have a great deadlift. Like just
accept it.
take what's there. Yeah. Do what your body's trying to get you to do because it's a good deadlift.
Next up, we have Mike. He is training for nationals on March 14th, so I think that was PA Nats. He's 47, competes in the 120 kilo weight class. Mike is an amputee, so that limits his ankle mobility. This is 170 for 3.
He still gets serious real depth though.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
He said this will probably be my opener, and I'll make 10 kilo jumps to 190 for my last squat. You can see my first rep is pretty strong, and by the third rep, my hips seem to rise too quickly. I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm probably just tired by that point. I'm usually pretty good with depth and generally pretty strong out of the hole, but my glutes are comparatively weak, and I tend to struggle with lockout. I have the same problem with my deadlift. I explode off the floor and then lose it at my knees. My lower back also always hurts after squats. I do a lot of core work to try to help mitigate that, but squats just hurt. Any insights as to why?
Do you know what nationals he is training for, or does it just say nationals?
It just says nationals, but he says he's walking out of the mono because that's what he has to do.
Okay, because I was gonna say if he can use the mono, I would use the mono.
Yeah.
Just like pick in the mono, move the hooks, and
Yeah.
But yeah, he says Powerlifting America in here.
Okay. If
he does say PA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think number one, like, yeah, your first rep is pretty exemplary. Like it's solid, it's good. I think a lot of the times when we see that pattern of the hips kind of rising up behind, it's quad not being able to do its job. But as an amputee, I'm not sure exactly like where you're amputated. So there might not be a lot for your quad to pull on, depending on where the amputation is. So it might be a bit of a challenge, and you might have to like do some unconventional things to work around the fact that you're unconventionally built at this point. So generally speaking, what I recommend for lifters would be to try to make sure we're driving that knee forward and really using the quads out of the bottom. Now, this is usually going to be something where I'm saying like, okay, let's slow things down. Let's focus in on the bottom part of the range of motion a little bit more. You know, pause squats, tempo pause squats, maybe some high bar work. But it definitely looks like, especially on this last rep here, like, yeah, we're getting pretty pitched back, and we're having to do a lot of work with, you know, the back and hips. So I can understand why we're running into, you know, a little bit of extra soreness in the back and hips after squatting. So, I mean, if you can, you know, doing some stuff like high bar squats, SSB, Bulgarians, and again, I don't know how limited we are on that left leg. Like, if you can do Bulgarians and work the crap out of that left quad, that might be a weak point to bring up. And obviously, if you're going to do that, do it on both legs. I'm not saying that you necessarily need to treat that leg differently unless you do. So it's going to kind of come down to your individual limitations and how much you can push, how much training stimulus you can get through that quad, because that might be the limiting factor here. If it is, yeah, I think training patterns that are going to, at the very least, give you a route to like compensate for maybe not having your quads able to pull on a certain part, so that you're able to train whatever other muscles are going to kind of take over and start to work in for the quad, would be a way that I would try to work around it. Also, I think, you know, we're pretty elbows back in our setup here, right? So if we can find a way to maybe, you know, do some work to loosen the shoulders, to be able to get that bar into a bit of a lower bar position, then we're going to have to depend less on the quad. We're going to be able to use the hip and back a little more intentionally, as opposed to being thrown into that position by virtue of not being able to maintain the knees forward and the quad tension kind of thing. So yeah, if we can get that bar down at all and kind of, you know, shorten the lever of the trunk, I think that's going to help a little. What are you thinking?
I think, yeah, it's going to be really hard to like prescribe anything for the lower body, because we don't know how that leg really is like connecting, how it's working at this point. I would really just look at like, yeah, the top half. The arms are really like swinging back. If you could maybe fix that, then yeah, we can get like a better position there. But really, I'm thinking just get really strong, right? Like, because of the limitations that we have, there's going to be like those compensatory patterns. At that point, I think you just take what you have and you just get brutally strong with it. I would look at a lot of SSB work, be that squatting, but also I think the first thing that came to my head when he said that like his lower back was hurting was just SSB seated good mornings, right? Just get that really, really strong ability to just lean forward and get back up. Because that's really what your squat looks like. And it's what it has to look like, right? Like you have to have almost that good morning-esque squat. So getting really, really strong at those good mornings, at something like an RDL or an SLDL, at just flexion into extension, at getting up, right? Just getting brutally strong, I think, is probably the best answer here, right? We're going to have a lot of limitations on what we can do technically. We don't have those same limitations when it comes to just getting strong.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, a lot of what I would cue lifters here is like, oh, let's put some more tension through the front of the foot, but you're gonna have to feel that very like through a proxy basically of like where your balance is. So like you're obviously not getting any proprioceptive feedback from that left leg, so you can't really just like press through your toes. To some extent, you might be able to keep driving knees forward out of the bottom. That's a really common cue for this exact issue, right? You can see the knee kind of start falling back there, even on the first rep. And I think more in subsequent reps, we see the knee come back and that pushes everything back. And then we end up in that kind of very classic squat morning pattern. So yeah, I mean, working on just that, like Nick said, kind of brutal strength through the posterior chain, through the hips, bringing up the tolerance there. I think seated and standing good mornings, SSB good mornings are great. And then yeah, anything you can do to just like hammer that quad so you can keep your knees forward a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think that's probably a wonderful attempt selection based on the fact that you can triple it. Great place to start for the meet, and then kind of feel it out and go from there. But yeah, anything else?
No, I mean, you got to work with what you got.
Yeah.
I think that you're strong. Just get stronger.
Yeah. Last one, Bill?
Yeah, this is our final submission. So this is Taylor. Taylor says, hi, I'm a huge fan and looking to start entering powerlifting competitions in the next year or so. My deadlift is the lift I'm least proud of, and I'm a little unsure about how my sumo deadlift form looks. I'm mostly concerned about two things: maintaining tightness in my lats while getting into position, and 2, my trunk angle. Any help is really appreciated. Love your free program and content on YouTube.
All right. Nick, I know you have opinions about the lats.
I think they're overrated.
I talk about using the lats all the time. So
I know you love lats.
I do love lats. I love lats.
I am unconvinced about the lats' importance in powerlifting.
There you go.
I don't think that they're super important. I think focusing too much on them leaves your arms and your upper body in a less advantageous position than if you were to just sort of relax them and let them come forward.
Okay. So how would you apply that to this lifter here? Because you can see, like, this is definitely a case of we're trying really hard to use
really
the lats.
slamming the lats
like
here.
Every rep, those shoulder blades are getting slammed down into position. So how would you have this lifter adapt and change things?
Instead of slamming sort of the lat down and trying to compress that, really old cue actually from, I don't know if you remember him from like Omar Isof's channel, like Jeremy Hamilton. I still remember shoulders, front pockets, right? Just trying
Taylor and I still use that.
trying to tuck the shoulder as far as it can go forward. I think that's going to be a lot better than, just slamming the lat down, because lat down versus the whole shoulder coming forward, that's like an inch.
Can be for sure.
Motion. Like it's pretty advantageous. Plus, if you already place your shoulder as low as it can go, it's not going to get pulled out of position farther, right? You are putting it into sort of its like terminal end range. The weight can't pull you out of position if you just place yourself into that position and then brace and move around that instead. So I also just don't think that lats are super important for torso rigidity. I'm just unconvinced on that. I'm not going to go into like we can, but.
I mean, that's fair. So I definitely agree. I think that this lifter is doing a lot more retraction than what is necessary, right? I think the depression we're getting out of this movement, sure, probably helpful, but we're also getting a lot of retraction. And I agree with Nick trying to cue like long arms, shoulder blades, front pocket. Big fan of those cues for sure. Now, the other thing I'm seeing with this lifter is, we're definitely seeing him sort of adapt to a certain position here and then pull from a very different position. So I'm curious, like, what would you recommend he do to try to like reconcile those two and the difference between them?
So I would like to see like a camera angle from sort of like that more front view to see what the knees and the hips are doing.
Sure.
I imagine he's like it. Judging from this angle, I feel like he might be shoving them out a bit farther than I'd like, just because I feel like the hips sort of they round under a decent amount, right? And that tells me that we're probably over cueing external rotation just a bit. Again, I can't really tell from this angle, but I imagine that, you know, if we looked at the front and sort of allowed a bit more internal rotation, allowed the foot to go a bit more flat as opposed to what I imagine is sort of like trying to press outwards, then we could, you know, allow more pronation in the foot, allow more internal rotation in the femur and the hip, and then have those hips come back. And then we can actually end up sitting them a bit farther down while still having that tension as opposed to just having them hiked way up. And I think also what that allowed to do is I think the bars may be a bit close.
Okay.
Right? I think if the bar was a bit farther away and then we sort of closed the distance off by allowing the knee to travel a bit more forward, allow the hips to sort of follow that knee while still staying open and back, then the torso can get more of that upright position. And then if we allow more of that sort of like forward shoulder position, a bit more flexion at the start in the back, have a head position that isn't yanking so far backwards, then we have a much more sustainable position, especially off the ground. And then when we lock out, it can just be, you know, the knees lock, the hips swing through. Right?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I might recommend for this lifter is to ditch the belt, at least for now, because I think one of the things we're seeing is just a very inconsistent positioning. And I think sometimes, especially early on, if you're still kind of fine-tuning your brace and what it feels like and hip height and knee forward versus knee back, a lot of the times the belt is just like it maybe contributes some stiffness and some rigidity, but I think it can take away from your ability to feel out and be consistent with your positioning. So I think maybe ditch the belt and try to just find good positioning and work on being consistent with that positioning for a while before we re-implement the belt. I think overall, in the long run, you know, maybe the belt's a helpful thing, but for now, while we're trying to figure out what it feels like to find tightness and to brace, it might just kind of be confounding things. I really like, Nick was talking about, you know, allowing the bar a little more forward and kind of bringing the knees forward to meet it. And I think that's right in line with one of the things I'm seeing here is that, you know, this position here, I can't draw a straight line with the mouse, but is great, right? We're seeing the middle of that shoulder blade kind of right in line over the bar. But we start to pull from kind of like back here. When you wedge yourself down and back so hard, I think we end up putting more of your body kind of like behind the bar than needs to be there. And when we overly commit to being behind the bar, like something's got to give as we come up. So we're seeing the hips come up, the shoulders come forward. Whereas I think if you allowed yourself to be a little more on the front of the foot and a little more balanced, as opposed to being quite so heel heavy in your setup, I think that would solve some of those issues right away as well. I definitely am in agreement with Nick on the head position. I think craning the head back like that and putting so much focus in the upper back, again, I think there's a bit of a give and take when it comes to bracing the trunk and positioning the trunk. And I think if we pull too much tension and tightness and aim for too much extension here, it makes it hard to maintain more neutral positioning here. Whereas if we kind of let this go a little bit, like Nick was talking about with shoulder blades front pocket, maybe a little less retraction, maybe even slightly less depression, just kind of letting the shoulder blades get pulled to where they're going to get pulled, and then incorporating the upper back into the brace, which is the thing that I will cue lifters to do, then I think we're going to be able to maintain more neutrality here, and we're going to see less getting pulled out of position. But another sort of big concept I would try to introduce this lifter to is just finding more tension before the pull, trying to incorporate, like, yes, we're slamming the upper back into position, but I don't think when we started the pull, we've found much tension from like here down. Like we have all this tension up here, but we have no real tension, bracing, tightness, or anything like that from there down. So I would actually set and find this tension first and then incorporate that. Like you're sitting your hips to height but you're not levering, pulling yourself into position. Like when you bring hips up like this, right? Before you bring the hips down, I like the cue lifters to start pushing against the floor and actively resist pulling yourself in against the bar so you can find that tightness in position instead of just sitting down and then having to find tension and tightness from there. Just being a little bit more patient with kind of the earlier phase of the lift, so we're not seeing that position change quite so much.
Yeah, I was gonna say that like we haven't touched on like pressing to the floor at all. It seems like we've only talked about pulling, and he's treating it a lot like a pull, which is good. It is a deadlift. It is a pull ultimately, but we do need to get some drive into the floor, and we need to cue that. And I think that, like you were talking about, where he's too far behind the bar, it's really hard to press into the ground if it also feels like we're falling back, because we want to pull against the bar just to maintain balance, really, right? Something that I really like to look for in my own pulls and with my athletes is just if you can sort of sit in that bottom position comfortably for a long time without needing to use the bar as like a counterbalance and not fall over, you're in a good position to push from, right? Because you're balanced. It doesn't look like he's in that. It looks like at the very bottom, he is counterweighting against that bar a bit just to stay up.
Like it's being pulled into his shins pretty much every time he sits down.
Just being able to balance over top of it, and then that way you can sort of have almost like a linear line of force as opposed to like sort of always craning backwards, right? I think a really good way to like practice that, weirdly enough, is conventional deadlifts.
Yeah.
I think that conventional is a great way to just learn midfoot balance, because you don't have to worry so much about sort of lateral sway or anything. You can just be perfectly stacked over the bar, and then learn where that sort of midfoot position is from like the bottom up, and then learn how to like push off of the ground to achieve a deadlift. So throwing in some conventional accessories, I think, wouldn't be the worst idea.
Yeah. I think there's been a lot of coaching specifically for the sumo deadlift, and I think I've probably even said this before about, you want to pull yourself into the point where it almost feels like you're falling backwards. And I think the almost there needs to be more heavily emphasized, because you don't want to actually be falling backwards. Like Nick says, I think one of the things that I've found success with specifically in my deadlift and my deadlift training recently has been being a bit more on the front of the foot. And I think one of the issues that I've had in my deadlift over the past couple of years was being too far back. And I think I kind of got away with that for a lot of years in my pull, just like driving through the heels, and everything just kind of fell into place. But over the years, we have those cues that work for us, and then we lean harder and harder and harder into them. And I think for myself, I ended up way too far back on my heels to the point where now I'm trying to, recenter myself and have a little bit more forefoot or toe pressure. So I think if you're getting to the point where you're almost falling back, you're probably going a little bit too far. Again, the emphasis in that cue should be on the almost, not on the falling back. But anything else to add?
No.
All right.
Stay balanced. Midfoot pressure.
Stay balanced out there, folks.
Stay balanced.
All right. Well, big thanks to Nick for coming on the channel and, chatting with us through all of this technique stuff. Again, where can people find you, man, if they want to check you out?
N.Manders on Instagram, or Clean Strength Fitness also on Instagram. Cool. Not going to talk about the site anymore.
The site may or may not be there. We don't know.
I promise it.
And yeah, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. Let us know who you think we should get next, or if you have something to contribute to the conversation, leave it down there, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.